Trapped behind enemy lines. The untold war story. They tried to forget. The first thing Private Elias Kern heard was not the order to advance. It was silence. The kind of silence that soldiers learn to fear more than gunfire. The kind that arrives just before the world catches fire. It was the winter of 1944, somewhere in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and the silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the tree line exploded. Artillery shells tore through the pine canopy above him, like the hand of God reaching down in fury. Men who had been standing beside him one moment were simply gone the next, dissolved into smoke and splinter, and a sound so violent it pressed against the chest like a physical thing. Kern threw himself into the mud, his face pressed against frozen earth that smelled of pine resin and blood. His rifle clutched against his body as the world above him burned. Somewhere to his left, a man was screaming. Somewhere to his right, another man had stopped screaming, which was worse. The radio operator, a boy from Ohio named Donahue who had shown everyone a photograph of his dog just 3 days earlier, was lying face down in the snow with the radio still strapped to his back, the antenna bent at an angle that told you everything you needed to know without having to look closer. They were cut off, surrounded, and they did not yet fully understand how completely, how terrifyingly alone they had become. Stay with us, because what these men endured in the days that followed would become one of the most harrowing, least told survival stories of the entire Second World War. To understand how a company of American infantrymen came to find themselves trapped behind German lines in the dense, freezing wilderness of the Belgian Ardennes, you must first understand what the German High Command was attempting, and why almost no one on the Allied side saw it coming. By the autumn of 1944, the consensus among Allied intelligence was built on confidence. The Wehrmacht was broken, they believed. Germany was bleeding from the Eastern Front. Her cities were rubble beneath Allied air campaigns, and the liberation of Paris had sent a wave of euphoric certainty through Allied command. The war, many believed, would be over by Christmas. Adolf Hitler believed something different. In the deep secrecy of the Führerhauptquartier, Hitler had been developing what he personally called his master stroke, a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forests, the same dense, supposedly impassable terrain through which German forces had stunned the world in 1940. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. 25 German divisions, including elite panzer units, would punch through a lightly defended stretch of Allied lines, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The blow would split the Allied armies in two, force a negotiated peace on the Western Front, and allow Germany to redirect its entire military strength eastward against the Soviets. His generals thought it was madness. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt privately called it a fantasy built on collapsing foundations. But Hitler had forbidden doubt, and so in the pre-dawn darkness of December the 16th, 1944, Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was unleashed. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. It was the largest German offensive operation in the West since the fall of France, and it struck at precisely the weakest point in the Allied line, a section held by exhausted, recently arrived and woefully understrength American infantry divisions who had been sent to the Ardennes precisely because it was considered a quiet sector, a place to rest, a place where nothing was supposed to happen. Nothing was supposed to happen. And then everything did. The men of Kern's unit, a rifle company attached to the 106th Infantry Division, had arrived in the Ardennes only days before the offensive began. Many were replacements, young men fresh from training camps in the American South and Midwest who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their officers were experienced enough to recognize inexperience when they saw it, and experienced enough to know that there was nothing to be done about it now. You worked with what the Army gave you, and the Army had given you boys who still kept letters from their mothers in their breast pockets. The German assault on the morning of the 16th hit the 106th Division with a ferocity that no training exercise could have prepared anyone for. Within hours, entire battalions were surrounded, overrun, or simply obliterated. 2 full regiments of the 106th, more than 8,000 men, would ultimately be forced to surrender in what became the largest mass surrender of American troops since the Civil War. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would come to be known, was already consuming men at a rate that staggered imagination. But Kern's company was not among those who surrendered. They were among those who ran, not from cowardice, but from the simple mathematics of survival. Their commanding officer, a 32-year-old captain from Georgia named Thomas Aldridge, made the decision in a moment of brutal clarity. To stay in position was to die or be captured. To move was to risk death but preserve the possibility of something else. Aldridge gathered his remaining men, 61 soldiers, reduced from over 130 within a single morning, and ordered them east, not toward the German advance, away from it, into the forest. What happened next shocked even veteran soldiers who later heard the account. The forest swallowed them. That is the only way to describe it. The Ardennes in December is not the Ardennes of tourist maps or peacetime imagination. It is a world of compressed darkness beneath canopies so dense that snow falls in curtains from the branches rather than from the sky. The temperature at night dropped to well below freezing. The ground was iron hard beneath a skin of snow that concealed every root, every stream, every depression that could twist an ankle or swallow a man to the knee. Fog settled through the trees in the mornings and did not lift until midday, and sometimes did not lift at all. Aldridge had a compass, 2 maps that covered the general region, but not the specific terrain, and 61 increasingly frightened men who were watching their breath cloud in the freezing air and listening, always listening, to the distant rumble of artillery that told them the front was no longer where they had left it. They moved only at night in those first days. During daylight hours, they went to ground in whatever cover the forest provided, beneath fallen timber, inside the ruins of abandoned farm outbuildings, pressed into the frozen earth of shallow ravines. German patrols moved through the same forest. Twice in the first 48 hours, Aldridge's men lay perfectly motionless while German infantry passed within yards of their position. So close that the Americans could hear the soldiers speaking, could see the glow of a cigarette, could smell the distinct odor of German field rations and unwashed wool. No one moved. No one coughed. No one breathed too loudly. Each time the patrol passed, each time the Americans waited another hour before daring to move again, but the physical toll of those first days was becoming visible on every face. Food was nearly exhausted. Each man had been carrying 3 days of sea rations when the offensive began, and those 3 days were now behind them. The wounded, 12 men who had been hit during the initial bombardment, needed attention that the company's sole medic, a quietly capable man named Vasquez, could only partially provide with the supplies remaining in his kit. 2 of the wounded could not walk without assistance. One, a sergeant from Minnesota named Halverson, who had taken shrapnel across his left thigh, was developing an infection that Vasquez looked at with an expression he carefully kept from showing to the others, but could not entirely hide from Aldridge. If you enjoy true historical war stories, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this one are what we are here to tell, and there are many more waiting for you. By the 4th day, the situation had changed in ways that made it worse. The men had managed to supplement their rations with whatever the forest could provide. Frozen berries, bark, the carcass of a deer that may have been killed by artillery concussion or may simply have frozen to death in the night. It was not enough. Men who had been carrying themselves on adrenaline and the specific electricity of fear were now moving with the slow, deliberate conservatism of the genuinely depleted. Their muscles ached not from exertion, but from cold and insufficient calories. Their feet, several men were now dealing with the early stages of trench foot, that ancient infantry misery that the army had tried to prevent with lectures and dry sock rotations, and that the forest was busy creating anyway. Hurt with a persistent, dull intensity that a man learned to carry inside him like cargo. Aldridge held brief councils each evening before dark. He spread his maps on the ground and pointed to where he believed they were, which was an estimate built on dead reckoning and the positions of stars he could occasionally see through gaps in the canopy. He told his men what he knew. They were somewhere south and east of the town of Saint-Vite, which had been a major American supply depot before the German advance. Whether Saint-Vite was still in American hands, he could not say. The distant sound of artillery suggested the fighting was extensive and continuing, but artillery sound in forested, mountainous terrain is a treacherous guide. It echoes, it distorts, it tells you there is a battle without telling you where, or between whom, or which direction you should walk to find friendly soldiers rather than enemy ones. Two of his non-coms, a staff sergeant named Briggs and a corporal named Moreau, came to him separately on the fourth night with the same concern delivered in different words. The men were beginning to lose faith not in Aldridge personally, but in the possibility of the situation. That distinction mattered enormously to a commander. A soldier who has lost faith in his officer can be replaced or reassigned. A soldier who has lost faith in the situation, who has looked at the cold and the hunger and the German patrols and the infected leg of the man lying against a tree 20 yards away, and made the private internal calculation that survival is no longer probable, that soldier is dealing with something that no order can address. Aldridge listened to both men. He thanked them. He told them he understood. Then he went and spoke to his company in the darkness of a Belgian forest, his voice low and careful and carrying something in it that several survivors would describe decades later as the specific quality of a man who has decided to refuse what the situation is telling him. He told them they were going to move west, toward the American lines, toward Saint-Vith or whatever lay beyond it. They were going to move carefully and they were going to move together and they were going to bring every man with them, including the ones who needed to be helped. He did not promise them they would make it. He promised them only that they would try. Comment below where you are watching from, because this story of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances deserves to be heard around the world. What these soldiers discovered deep behind enemy territory would haunt survivors for decades. On the sixth day, the company encountered a farmhouse. It appeared through the trees like something from a dream. A low stone structure with a pitched roof, a barn attached to the main building by a covered passage, smoke rising faintly from the chimney. Aldridge halted the column 200 meters back and sent 2 scouts forward, a pair of twins from rural Tennessee named Boyd and Cass Hensley, experienced woodsmen who moved through the forest with a quietness that the other men had always found slightly eerie and now found purely valuable. The scouts returned 20 minutes later with a report that was simultaneously encouraging and complicated. The farmhouse was occupied by a Belgian family, a man of perhaps 60, his adult daughter, and 2 young children. There were no German soldiers on the premises, though vehicle tracks in the snow suggested recent traffic on the road that ran past the property. The old man had seen the scouts from his window and had not raised an alarm. He had, in fact, made a gesture that Boyd interpreted as beckoning. Aldridge made a decision. They went in. What followed was one of those moments of human warmth that survive in the testimony of veterans because they stand in such violent contrast to everything surrounding them. The Belgian farmer, his name was Albert Leclerc, and he had lived through the German occupation of Belgium in the First World War as a young man and had watched history repeat itself with the exhausted recognition of someone who has seen a bad dream return. Took one look at the gaunt, frozen, hollow-eyed American soldiers filing through his door and began feeding them without a word of instruction to anyone. His daughter moved with quiet efficiency, producing bread and cold meat and something warm to drink from the kitchen, while the children watched the soldiers with the enormous, serious eyes of children who have grown up quickly in wartime. Aldridge set guards at every window and door. He had the men rotate through the kitchen in small groups so that no large concentration of soldiers was visible from outside at any moment. He sat with Leclerc at the kitchen table while Vasquez worked on Halverson's leg in the back room, and through a combination of Aldridge's fragmentary French and Leclerc's equally fragmentary English, and a great deal of gesture and map pointing, the 2 men shared what they knew. What Leclerc told him was not encouraging. The German advance had been massive and was continuing. German units were moving through the area constantly. Armor on the main roads, infantry in the side roads and forest tracks. The nearest town that Leclerc believed might still be in American hands was further west than Aldridge had estimated. Much further. And between here and there was a river, the Somme, that was running fast and cold and would not be easy to cross. But the worst news came last. Leclerc told him, carefully and with evident distress, that a German unit had established a patrol base in an abandoned mill approximately 2 kilometers to the north. They were methodical. They searched the forest in regular patterns. They had already visited his farm once and would visit again. When? Aldridge asked. Leclerc looked at him. He held up 2 fingers. 2 days. Stay with us. Because the worst was still waiting just ahead. And what this company of men attempted in those final 48 hours would push every one of them to the absolute edge of what a human being can endure. They left before dawn the next morning. Leclerc's daughter pressed food into as many pockets as she could fill. The old man stood in his doorway in the darkness and said nothing, only watched them go with an expression that Aldridge, for the rest of his life, never found adequate words to describe. The Somme River. That was the objective now. Cross the river, move west, find the lines, find the army, find some version of alive that did not involve a German prison camp or a frozen forest grave. They moved by day now, carefully using the forest for cover, avoiding roads entirely, moving through terrain that punished every step. The wounded were distributed among the able-bodied, each injured man supported by 2 healthy ones in rotation. Halverson's leg was worse. Vasquez told Aldridge quietly that it needed surgical attention within 24 hours, or the alternatives became very dark. Aldridge told Vasquez to keep that between the 2 of them. On the afternoon of the 7th day, they heard engines, German armor, the distinctive diesel sound of panzer vehicles moving on a road parallel to their line of march, approximately 500 meters to the north. Aldridge froze the column, and they stood in the trees and listened to the mechanical voice of the enemy, passing like weather, massive and indifferent and terrifyingly close, until the sound faded south and the forest returned to its frozen silence. But the engines had covered another sound, one that only became apparent when the armor noise was gone. Dogs. The German patrol from the mill had come early. What happened in the next 11 minutes was described by survivors in terms that carry the compressed, sensory, overwhelming quality of genuine trauma. Aldridge threw the column into movement. Fast movement, abandoning stealth for speed, crashing through the undergrowth with the sound discipline of a herd of frightened animals, because there was no longer any point in silence. Behind them, they could hear the dogs, 2 of them, by the sound. And behind the dogs, the shouts of German soldiers moving fast through the trees. A soldier named Prentice, a big quiet man from West Virginia, who had been helping carry Halverson for 3 days without complaint, turned and told the man beside him to keep moving. He positioned himself behind a tree with his rifle and waited. He fired 4 shots. The pursuit slowed. He fired 2 more. Then he ran. He made it. He reached the column 3 minutes later, breathing in the huge, tearing gas of maximum effort, and took up Halvorson's arm again without being asked and kept moving. The river appeared through the trees like a revelation, dark and fast and brutally cold, perhaps 40 meters across, with no bridge in sight. The nearest bridge had been confirmed by Leclerc as occupied by a German checkpoint. But the river here at this point was broken by a line of rocks that created something not quite a ford, but something that might be crossable by men desperate enough. Aldridge looked at it. He looked at his men. He looked at the forest behind them. He walked into the river first. The cold was an assault. It was not like being cold. It was like being grabbed by something with enormous hands that intended to stop every system in your body simultaneously. He waded to his chest and kept walking, his feet finding purchase on the slick river stones, with the specific, desperate concentration of a man who understands that falling here means dying here. Behind him, his men followed. The able-bodied first to establish the route, then the wounded passed between them in a human chain, then the rear guard, and the Belgian winter river did its best to kill them all and failed. On the western bank, 60 men lay in the snow and gasped and shook with a cold so profound it felt like a kind of prayer. Halverson was still breathing. They were all still breathing. They made contact with an American armored reconnaissance unit on the morning of the 8th day. A patrol of M8 Greyhound armored cars moving along a logging track, who very nearly opened fire on the ragged column of men emerging from the trees before a sergeant in the lead vehicle recognized the American helmets and held his fire. The soldiers of the patrol later said they had never seen men who looked quite like that. Not wounded, most of them, not obviously broken, but carrying something on their faces that was difficult to describe. Hollowed out, one veteran said, like men who had looked at something and decided to look away but couldn't quite manage it. Aldridge reported to the division rear area and delivered a full account of his company's movements, the German positions he had observed, the patrol base near Leclerc's farm, the vehicle traffic on the forest roads. Military intelligence officers questioned him for 2 hours. His information contributed to operational planning in ways he was never fully informed about, which is the nature of information in war. It flows upward and disappears into decisions made by men who cannot tell you what they did with what you gave them. Halverson was evacuated by jeep to a field hospital. The surgeons saved his leg. Of the 61 men who had entered the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 17, 1944, 53 crossed the Somme River 8 days later. 8 men had been lost, 3 killed outright in the initial bombardment, 2 who had died of wounds in the forest, 1 who had simply vanished in the chaos of the pursuit on the 7th day and was never conclusively accounted for, and 2 who were captured by a German patrol on the 3rd day and spent the remainder of the war in a prison camp in eastern Germany. The company's survival was noted in divisional records. It was not celebrated. There was too much happening. The Battle of the Bulge was too vast and consuming and terrible for the survival of 53 men to register as anything more than a small fact in a ledger of enormous facts. No medals were issued for what they had done in the forest. No ceremony marked their return. They were fed, given dry clothing, assigned to replacement units, and returned to the war. The war, after all, was not finished with them yet. What happened to these men afterward tells you something important about the relationship between history and memory, and about the particular way that survival can become its own kind of invisibility. Aldridge survived the war. He returned to Georgia, married, worked for 30 years as a high school teacher in a small town outside Savannah. He taught American history. He never, in those 30 years, spoke to his students about what had happened in the Ardennes, not because he was ashamed, not because he had forgotten, but because he could not find words that were adequate to the thing, and he had too much respect for the experience to clothe it in words that were not adequate. He spoke about it once, in 1978, to a historian named Garrett, who was compiling a study of small unit survival in the Second World War. The interview lasted 4 hours. Aldridge was calm and precise and detailed throughout. At the end, Garrett asked him what he thought about when he thought about those 8 days. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then he said he thought about the river, about walking into that black cold water and the men following him in, about the fact that they had all followed him in. He had not been certain they would. He had walked into the river without being certain, and they had come anyway, and that was the thing he thought about. Vasquez became a physician. He practiced family medicine in New Mexico for 40 years. He kept a photograph on his office wall, not of the war, not of the Ardennes, but of Albert Leclerc's farmhouse, taken from a photograph that Leclerc's daughter had sent him in 1962, found through a veterans organization after years of searching. He never explained to patients what the photograph was. If they asked, he said it was a place in Belgium where he had once been very cold and very grateful. Boyd and Cass Hensley returned to Tennessee and spent the rest of their lives within 15 miles of where they were born. They did not talk about the war, which was common, but neighbors noted that the 2 brothers, already close before the war in the way of twins, became after it something beyond close. Something that required a different word, a word that described 2 men who had together held themselves absolutely still in a Belgian forest, while German soldiers walked past them close enough to touch, and had survived it, and had looked at each other afterward and understood without speaking that they now owed each other something that could not be calculated or repaid. Prentice, the man who had turned to slow the pursuit at the river, was awarded no commendation for what he had done. The action was not observed by any officer. It existed only in the testimony of the men who had been ahead of him, running, and had heard the shots behind them and known what those shots meant. Years later, when a veterans group attempted to have him recognized formally, the paperwork was incomplete, The witnesses were elderly or dead, and the Army's bureaucratic machinery, which handles such requests with the patient indifference of institutional memory, declined. He died in 1991 in a hospital in Roanoke, Virginia, with his family around him, unhonored by anyone except the men who had crossed that river because he had bought them the minutes to reach it. The Battle of the Bulge itself, the vast, catastrophic confrontation into which Aldridge's company had been dropped like a stone into a storm, lasted until late January 1945. It cost the American Army approximately 75,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing. The German offensive failed, the Wehrmacht, having expended its last significant strategic reserve in the West, was left with nothing to stop the Allied advance into Germany itself. The war in Europe would be over in 4 months. The Ardennes campaign is remembered. Museums have been built, books written, films produced, ceremonies held each December in the Belgian cold, with aging veterans and politicians and the descendants of both. But memory is a strange instrument. It tends toward the large, toward the famous units, the celebrated commanders, the iconic moments that photograph well and narrate cleanly. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne, Patton's relief column, the command staff, the grand decisions, the turning points that can be pointed to on maps, the small stories, the 61 men who walked into a forest and came out 53, who crossed a freezing river on a December morning because their captain walked in first. Those stories tend to settle into the silence beneath the larger narrative. Not forgotten exactly, but not remembered either, existing in that difficult middle space where history keeps the things it does not know what to do with. Aldridge died in 2003. He was 91 years old. At his funeral, a man in his 80s, one of the survivors, a man named Kowalski, who had been 19 years old when he crossed the Somme River, stood in a Georgia church and said that Thomas Aldridge was the reason he had grown old enough to have grandchildren, and that he wanted that said out loud in a building with God listening. Outside, it was raining. It was the kind of cold December rain that falls in certain places and makes you think, without quite knowing why, of frozen forests and dark rivers and the specific, irreducible humanity of men who kept walking when walking seemed impossible. The war is long over. The forest has grown back. The Somme River still runs cold and fast in December, indifferent to everything that has been asked of it. Albert Leclerc's farmhouse still stands, though the family is long gone and different people live there now who know nothing of what happened in their barn on a winter night in 1944, and nothing of the old man who stood in his doorway in the darkness and watched strangers disappear into the trees and carried that image for the rest of his life. That is how it goes with the stories that war makes and history misplaces. They do not vanish, they simply wait. In the letters kept in a drawer, in the photographs on a physician's wall, in the things that men cannot say to their students but carry into every room they enter for the rest of their lives. They wait for someone to look closely enough to find them. And when you find them, when you sit with them long enough to understand what they cost and what they meant, they ask only one thing of you, that you remember, that you do not let the silence win.